First of all, thank you all for joining us for this online talk. Um, I'm Peter Flannery, the Senior Curator and Collections Manager here at the Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery. And we are on an online platform today, so I think we're all joining from different places. But I did want to acknowledge that the Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery is located on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The gallery is situated on the Haldeman Tract, land promised to Six Nations in 1784 that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Yet today, the Six Nations reside on less than 5% of this unceded territory. Indigenous peoples have inhabited this land for thousands of years. We respectfully and gratefully share this territory in peace and friendship, and we reaffirm our commitment to do the work to unlearn and relearn towards a true reconciliation. I'm really excited to be doing this online talk today with Anong Migwans Beam related to our Painting with Clay exhibition, which she co-curated with Elke Weinstein, and really lucky to have Franchesca Hebert-Spence also here with us to have what I think is going to be a really great conversation around this exhibition and the Beam family and Indigenous ceramics. Anong Migwans Beam is a painter, art historian, and arts administrator from Shiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island. She was born to artist parents Carl Beam and Anne Beam and was raised with a meaningful connection to her artistic familial roots and rich ancestral heritage. Alongside her art practice, Beam has been actively involved in her local community and in curatorial work and teaching. She served as the art director and executive director of the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation from 2016 to 2018 and was a guest instructor in painting at Harvard Art Museums in June 2023. She launched Beam Paints, her own line of watercolor and oil paints, in 2017. And as I mentioned, she co-curated the Painting with Clay exhibition that's on display now. Franchesca Hebert-Spence is an Anishinaabe and a member of Siking First Nation, currently residing in the Inuvialuit settlement region. She's a cultural producer with a background as a ceramic artist and social beater. She's the inaugural curator of Indigenous ceramics at the Gardiner Museum, with previous roles at the National Gallery of Canada, Indigenous Art Centre, and Art Gallery of Alberta. Hebert-Spence holds a master's degree in cultural studies from the University of Winnipeg, and a BFA in ceramics from Brandon University. She's currently a doctoral candidate in cultural mediations at Carleton University and the 2024 recipient of the Joan Yvonne Lowndes Award. So I'm going to turn it over to Anong and Franchesca for this conversation. For everyone who's attending, we do have the chat open. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to type them into that chat. And then Anong and Franchesca will be able to answer those either throughout as they apply or towards the end before we wrap up. All right.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Peter. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really grateful to be exhibiting and working with Canadian Clay and Glass Gallery, and also for the connection with the Gardiner that was really important to my family, and also to have Franchesca here representing the Gardiner, who's lent some beautiful pieces to the exhibition. So thanks for meeting me here.
Thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be in conversation with you, and I've really loved your work for a long time. I'm also just so impressed by all the things that you do, and there's just between running your own business and being a maker, but also such an active community member. It's just really, really beautiful to see. Obviously, many hats and a lot of labor.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of interesting work everywhere, and I was really lucky to be employed at Ojibwe Cultural Foundation. I also want to thank them for loaning a piece to the exhibition. And the piece that they lent is really interesting because it kind of speaks to how we get here, and a series of interesting coincidences that led to this exhibition as well. So the piece that's on loan from the OCF is a community reproduction pot, and it was done after I was at the OCF, but it relates to a collection of ceramic work that I was working with. And before I got to the OCF, they were designated as a repository for the repatriation of archaeological collections. And that was really interesting because they were building new ground in doing repatriations from an Indigenous institution to other Indigenous institutions. So that was really exciting. But it was also something that I think anyone working in public art or arts organizations, could probably community work, could understand it was really underfunded. And it was a really massive portfolio. I mean, to drop here are all of these collections of artifacts, that these large collections were in storage there. And I was a curator there, and I actually found a collection that was supposed to be returned and actually hadn't. It was marked as returned to the OCF, and it was a collection that actually related to our community from Manitoulin. And when I started reading through the notes, I could see that the majority of this collection wasn't actually returned. It was still in storage in different zones, which is kind of that, I guess the umbrella thing is that Indigenous communities need to know and really understand what kind of pieces relating to their communities are in what institutions and storage containers that are owned by archaeologists and the province, because there are things in those containers that maybe aren't of interest, or they don't stand out to maybe Western or standard, like academically trained archaeologists, but to practitioners of arts in community, they're incredibly important. So discovering that there were ceramic records from only maybe 15 minutes from where I lived that were pre-contact ceramic records, and they had been talked about and stored and packed up in the 80s and moved off the island. And my dad had actually heard about them, and he had heard like secondhand from a student who was on the dig there. So he was always looking for these pieces, and it was interesting that in my time I was part of getting to get a bit of a clue about them. And I think it's something that's still unfolding, because all of these pieces are still not entirely returned to Chiging and to Manitoulin. So it is really, really interesting for me in ceramics. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go on a big tear here, and then
that's such an interesting story.
Well, like, because how it kind of, I remember my dad taking us to all these any museum he could find, like the Gardiner, the ROM, the up in Midland, different locations, looking for those pieces. And they weren't on display because I think the common kind of, my understanding of the common discussion, or what we heard back then, was, oh, the Anishinaabe weren't a ceramic producing people. And it was mainly the Mohawks who were producing ceramics. And, that's incredibly demoralizing to a traditional practitioner of an art. And I can think of a few people that it definitely depressed to be told that you're doing something, oh, that's not traditional. So, yeah, that's something that maybe these pieces, maybe because they weren't a lot, or they just kind of fell into a spot lack of conversation. So the two pieces in there are, one, there's a community reproduction from local clay of a vessel, and then there's a 3D replica from Hilary Kaizik, who did some work at University of Western Sustainable Archaeology with Neil Ferris, and she did 3D replicas using computer modeling to take a shard or a fragment and then be able to to imagine the rest of the body. So that was really cool to see because I think the majority, not all, but quite a lot of these vessels were fragments. So to be able to see 3D technology and archaeologists help out in making this kind of come to life that was an exciting thing in that show.
Yeah, that's super neat. And so it's kind of also like a full circle moment of, seeing the value in these shirts and like the value of this work. Not because like you went to school for archaeology and you can like tell the difference between the different castellations and the punctures, but it's just from like seeing, right? And that like process of like constantly being engaged and being in conversation with like what is like a living culture, which is kind of like it's being adjusted now within like practices of making sure people are consulting and all that stuff, but like there's still more work that needs to be done, and there's a lot of literature that needs to be corrected, but there's still like a complete absence of like academic literature produced by Indigenous voices on our ceramics. And like as I'm like writing labels for the Gardiner right now and the reinstall, like I'm sure you and Elka found this as well. Like there's just not a lot published, but like you have to like stomp the pavement and go into community and find folks who have like this knowledge. And
it's interesting, and I noticed that with my son. So in the exhibition, there's my mother and my father, and then there's me, and then now my two sons are active in ceramics, and it's really important. It's interesting to see them, because when I was doing this work with learning from my parents, they were looking, and we hadn't there weren't any known representations of Indigenous, of like Anishinaabe, particular to our nation, ceramics. And so the boys, they're growing up in a zone where they came with me to the ROM to look at things when I worked at OCF, and they have just been around that. So they're a bit more aware of the things that are being found and kind of coming to light. And it's just an incredible feeling, because the pieces that were actually made pre-contact in Providence Bay, there were balls of clay ready to that was documented at the site, that there were balls of clay sitting there in a midden that they were making and firing pottery on site there. And that river flows to a lake that's directly behind this house that is connected to the river on the other side. And that's a spot where my son digs clay. That's a spot where his grandfather dug clay, his cousins have dug clay. And it's a connection that, an archaeologist at the time wasn't aware of, but through like working in community places like Canadian Clay and Glass, they can be a kind of champion these connections as we're making them, and that's really, really exciting. But it's interesting for him too. He noticed, like, and I have to answer those questions with him. So my sons are 14 and 16, and to have that question from him about, there's so much information about European and Asian ceramics, and there's nothing. How come I can't find any? Why aren't there any books talking about? And there are. It's not a total, emptiness, but it's striking how limited the conversation is.
Yeah, like not an absence, but I haven't seen those publications or those conversations led by local Indigenous voices, which I
Yeah,
think is where you have like these conflicts where like an archaeologist who doesn't live in the area, who doesn't like know what's going
yeah,
on, or like a scholar, it's not all archaeologists, but like,
yeah.
um,
This is definitely not to trash archaeologists, because I am
yeah.
so glad that the work was done at that site, and really that was salvage archaeology because there was going to be development in the area. So we're really
Oh,
lucky that that was that somebody called and said they found something, and that it was dug and protected. But to have to have it packed away, and then it is a difficulty too, because there is such a huge volume of archaeological findings just in the province, and I think people can get sensitive about archaeological findings on private property. But
yeah. But like it's from like their own lack of knowledge, not knowing how to engage with that work. And there's this connection between time and like being like as you said, like this connection to like not to romanticize it, but like land and place and also like community and living memory and like understanding what's been made and how it's been made versus like there's different types of knowledges, I guess, is kind of. And so the way that like like the remnants of like these works made by like ancestral makers is something because we're related to them. Well, I'm not related to your territory, but like we have
yeah,
ceramic in Manitoba specifically, like we were told that we made bad ceramics. This is a story that Casey Adams tells all the time, actually, because we have sandy soil. And like our clay can only be low fired as a result, and it crumbles. And like anybody who works with clay from a technical perspective, like you have a lot of flux. it's it's a thing. And so, but like being told that our ceramics is bad or that our clay was bad to make clay comes from a Euro-Western perspective. And so because of that, there was like essentially this like barrier, like this mental barrier, this like intellectual barrier to folks trying to understand more about like our production or the way that like we make things or think about them. Um, in the same way that like that likely happened in Manitoulin, where someone came up with like this theory and mental barrier, whereas if they had just gone in and chatted with people and like
yeah,
been
yeah,
present, um,
yeah, absolutely. And I also think like the uh, the convention, like naming conventions, and the
mm,
fact the the pottery that was found there was like given a term Algoma ware, and that was Thor Conway. That was his idea of what it should be called. And I mean, everything has to have some kind of a name, right? And I understand that definitely the limitations of funding and time, and maybe not being able to do the level of consultations that you want to, but yeah, it's definitely something to reach towards.
yeah, and like that being something that's changing. Like I'm really glad that you brought up OCF, but like the work that has been done and is like continuing to happen
Mhm.
um is so pivotal and I think really takes control, not control because that's like a power thing, but I think really sets the standard for this like relationship between community and relationship between researchers and like as like a gathering place
Mhm.
when we think about the way that Euro-Western institutions are set up, like the mandate of the Gardiner for a really long time and the Royal Ontario Museum, all of
Mhm.
these spaces is to educate people, right? And so if you find someone who's like professionally trained to take on these roles, went to university for it, it's because you are an expert in this field. And admittedly, as an Indigenous curator, I don't feel like I'm an expert of anything. But that's when you're coming from one, severe imposter syndrome, but two, like the things that we know about humility, like within our communities and like the way
Yeah,
that we're raised.
for sure.
That's such an integral part. And what happens when you enter a space with humility and like not admitting that you don't know or that you want to know, is
Mhm.
like that how that shifts practice in a really fundamental way. But like OCF isn't there to educate people. Like OCF there is to support the community and
Yeah,
and
yeah,
to gather. I don't know how else to say it.
yeah. I understand. I know what you're getting at there. And that really struck me working there too, is that I thought about, the difference between, there's such a massive difference between an Indigenous arts institution that is run and organized in community versus a Western arts institution. And I think part of that might come from just there are these fundamental differences in how we understand arts. And I think Western art, I'm gonna prepare for a whole lot of generalizations,
That's fine.
massive
That's
generalizations, that Western art is very individual centric. And when we go to institutions like the AGO or other arts institutions, we're seeing the product of an individual. And when we go to Indigenous arts institutions and community, we're generally finding a place that positions itself in service of the group, and the individuals appear to share within the group, and it's definitely a wider a wider net of activities. I was always amazed at just the breadth of things that had to happen at the OCF versus what would happen at I imagine at the AGO, because the AGO probably wouldn't have people walk in and want to people in crisis who are looking for connection to community or connection to culture. Like that just wouldn't really happen, you know.
Sorry, I
And
just imagine like if I walked into the
yeah, if you just
AGO
walk
or the
in,
ROM or any of them,
right, yeah,
and I was like,
you
I
know, the Whitney,
need help, you know. Oh my
like,
God, the
yeah,
Whitney, they'd
I'm
kick me
really,
out.
yeah, I'm lost and I'm searching for something, and but that's something that's so common in our institutions, and we were all kind of trained to and prepared to encounter that, of the intensity of and the openness of oh, you're welcome here, and we're all together learning. We're all going to learn together, and yeah, like what you said about humility earlier, and I found it really difficult. I did go to art school. I I had a lot of difficulty studying ceramics, and I ended up not really pursuing ceramics in post-secondary. But I went from a lifetime in ceramics in clay, and then I walked into a studio at School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which and I just had culture shock. I had a massive culture shock. I made a couple of things, and then I just felt so uncomfortable. I stopped going, and I changed my focus to other things that I think I felt more that I was learning for the first time and didn't have such a clash, or maybe I just went for a comfort zone. I'm not really sure. But it's been interesting watching my sons as well, because they've learned in this way. I think I'm really happy to I'm happy to talk about and encourage because I think it's really part of Indigenous communities and also like all communities. All communities really had apprenticeship and familial training, and we still really glorify that with the support of generational family businesses. You know, that's all kind of understood and appreciated. But in art, it's definitely something in this area, because like what you said, that in Indigenous ceramics is a very small corner of the written about practicum. Yeah, and yeah, I'm really excited that we're getting to have this conversation and kind of bring that aspect up.
Yeah, like I think what are different types of knowing, and um it's really present within the exhibition, I think, is like this confidence and like this relationship between the intergenerational relationship, I think, is so important. I feel like it's really emphasized within Indigenous art. And so like in one way I'm like, I don't want to romanticize it, but like at the other end of it, like
Mm-hmm.
there's a just there's like this, and like it also could totally be coming from like a place where like I was raised in foster care. And so like when I see that, I'm like, it feels so good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um and I think, oh, I should have asked Alex, but she was growing up, and one of the first like publications she ever saw was like Morrisseau on her coffee table, like the catalog that came with it, right? And
Okay.
like she grew up surrounded by Indigenous art in her home, like with her family and stuff like that. And so, you know, there were folks who were like busting out, doing really cool and powerful work, who were raised and surrounded by like cultural production. Um, and like we throw around the word art and craft and things like that, but like what does it mean to be in a space where you see a cradle board on the wall? Like what does it mean to be like living in a home where like your dad's championing for ceramics and like the presence of ceramics, even though everyone's telling him that they didn't exist. And he's like, look at these shards.
They were so clear. They were so clearly everywhere. It was so
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Just, you go to pick up a rock and it's a shard. So like, I think like that pride is so powerful, and like it comes from like this place of like deep love, and um also to like do something like that with your family, to make with your family, and to like we can barely play board games together sometimes.
Yeah.
Like
No. Well, I really recognize too at this point that it was a really conscious act of recreation for my dad too, because he went to residential school at a school in Spanish, the Gardiner School for Boys, and he had a really fragmented youth, and he experienced all of those things. And I think in art he found a channel to investigate. And one of my favorite things that he ever said was this idea of like, if you have a genuine inquiry, a genuine premise, then nothing is outside of your field of investigation. And it's I think it's a really exciting time to see. I see on Instagram so many more Indigenous ceramic artists, and I see them uh, pushing into representation and design. I think I'm gonna blank on her actual name, but Morningstar Ceramics. I think
yeah.
her work is really beautiful. I'm a super big fan. I think she's shown at Canadian Clay and Glass as well. Yeah, really, really exciting stuff.
Yeah, like there's like more space, and that there is like support for it. I think Yeah, thinking about, I think a lot about work that's happening within the Indigenous arts landscape as waves. Because like we also can't like categorize people through age, because like sometimes folks start later in life and things like that. And um so there's kind of like a back and forth that happens between the breaks. Um but yeah, seeing what the next wave is bringing, and to be like unapologetically like, I know one of the questions, like this is posed to a lot of ceramic artists in general, but why clay, you know? Whereas like if you ask that to a painter, they'd be like, because painting. No offense to the painters out there, but
Yeah.
there's a certain level of privilege there. um Kind of like when we do things with beads, and it's like, oh, like there's just this thing that happens with customary work that becomes entangled in these hierarchies of art making. But the to unapologetically just kind of like forge ahead and make work, and also like the flexibility that folks have between like production ceramics as well as like sculptural ceramics is really neat, because I think it's such a balanced way to approach, especially if you want to be an independent artist. And um like, how are we thinking about sustainable careers? How are we thinking about like how folks are able to support themselves? Because I don't know, this might just be like a conversation from earlier today that like I forget having, but like um how are these spaces supporting like our makers? um if it's like an acquisition every 5-10 years, like that's not really substantial. Exhibition fees are like incredibly low. um I know Carfax doing their best, but for the amount of labor that goes into putting together an exhibition, um and so there are other ways that we have to find, like that artists have to find to support themselves.
Yeah,
And
and I think it's interesting too on that note that something else that comes up is thinking about the differences in the view on practice, is that ceramics inside Indigenous art, inside communities, it was so connected as a functional thing, but also as an artistic practice. And with ceramics in the Western view, there's also that where is it craft or is it art? And
like that slash.
yeah, and I think that Indigenous ceramics, it has that slash plus a third on top, which is it historical or is it contemporary?
Hmm.
Yeah, so that's another aspect about it that's interesting to see people working through how we reference and understand Indigenous ceramics through the historical, and then make space for people who are really doing new things in it as well. Because I think really, we're at this point where we're all reveling in reclaiming a lot of knowledge. But some of my favorite pieces in this exhibition are um, pieces that were inspired by different ceramic traditions. There's a plate that's a star plate, which is a real hybrid. It's built by my dad. It looks like a Ogata Kenzan plate, a cake
Oh,
plate,
oh yeah, yeah.
and but it's made out of all hand dug clay and handmade paints that, or it's like different kinds of iron oxides, and then it has his own writing on it. So it's kind of a blend of times and influences. And then also there's some really beautiful electric fired cone six pieces that that would be considered the full Western purview. It's a store glaze on a store kiln and an electric thing, but the approach in the painting is still very individual. And then my sons are showing up, and they're throwing another mix in, that they're making glazes, and they're they just have a whole, they're
It's like
doing things.
kudos to them. Making glazes is a process.
It's really exciting to watch. Mhm.
But yeah, like the like Euro-Western and like academic like urge to like categorize
Mhm.
and create like these binaries between, but like as you were saying earlier, there's a lot more flexibility in like when we think about an Indigenous perspective on like making
Mhm.
and like art. I know there's like that essay, there's no word for art in my language, but like
Yeah.
our notions of like art or art question mark and
Mhm.
of life, I guess, is probably a more accurate. And so to like, I think that's also really interesting. Sorry, now I'm going to get into an art historical like, but that's really interesting. Like why, like your father and like the folks who were making at the same time. I think it was like this entire generation, this entire wave of makers were all
Mhm.
into collage and like having these conversations about like authenticity and expectations and but I think
Mhm.
the conversation goes so much deeper because like it that like that visual language or that way of speaking I think was more rooted in ways that like we think and that we act and we know that
That's
that plurality and like that lack of like boundaries, not like
mhm.
lack of personal boundaries, but like lack of those delineations, like that's why that visual, like the collage was such a big thing. I know like people kind of have tongue in cheek about collage now, but I think it's such a great art form for explaining and articulating the
For
way
sure.
that it feels.
For sure. I think that's really well put. And then it also kind of suggests something else that I think is really, really important to note, and that's the history of our nations and their adaptation and survival through adapting and becoming creative with a newer, expanding range of material. And I
Yeah.
think Barry Ace, and
Yeah.
yeah, this is super interesting because he's from our community of Chiking, and he would come back to exhibit and to share his knowledge and do different things. And he also came back and did ceramic workshops with David Migwans, who has a piece in the exhibition, who did work with my dad. And so I really enjoyed speaking about a piece that he donated to Ojibwe Cultural Foundation because it was this bandolier bag, and it looked, at first glance, it looks like this traditional bag, but the entire piece was beaded out of electrical components. So it's this incredible sculpture. It has an iPad in it. It turns on, and it shows a video where the beaded panel would be, and then these beautiful florals are made out of like diodes and electrical pieces. You would never know. You would never know to look at it. And I really enjoyed watching people come up close to it. And where we had it in the OCF was right opposed next to a traditional bandolier bag that was
Mm-hmm.
actually beaded. And I really like talking about that people, what do you think is traditional here? And what do we mean by that? Because Barry Ace's work here is just as traditional because he's working from his understanding of himself in this time for this culture. And that bandolier bag, even though we look at that as like, oh, that's OG traditional, but it's with these beads. And before the arrival of beads, everything was decorated with porcupine quills. If you've tried to do something with porcupine quills, like, it's brutal, it's hard, it's geometric. So our visual lexicon of shapes and expression was incredibly geometric for a long time. And then when beads arrived as an expressive medium, both. There was the birth of, the traditional, indigenous Great Lakes florals. And this is something that just keeps going along and going along. New techniques and that, I think that's what it means to be part of a living culture. That's what's exciting. And that's what's really exciting about ceramics at this point, because we're getting to come back to a practice that really was kind of limited for a while. So
Yeah, I'm so glad that you used the word limited, because the language used a lot of the time is like it was lost, it was gone, it was that, but it wasn't. Like, I think that's also really like important, like to acknowledge the continuity and that there are people who are actively doing the work to make sure that like we still know and still have like people who were like um either intentionally or unintentionally kind of doing this little squirreling away of like information and things like that. So like, you know, the way that you acknowledge those archaeologists who came in before the development and like squirreled those sherds away, but then like it kind of like ends there. And then also like, you know, your dad dragging you around to all these museums. And like
yeah,
also I really want to take a moment to acknowledge how hard it is to do that work, like how hard it is to be present within these collections sometimes, how hard it is still to get into collections.
yeah,
Um, and so for your dad, I'm like white passing. So like for me to be in these spaces, like it would have been even harder for your dad. It's hard to be within those spaces and to be given access. And so to like persevere at that time to continue to do that work is so incredibly important. And there's like a number of people who have done that work and who have been those people in our communities across the country. And um I think it's just so important to acknowledge that. And every time we describe indigenous ceramic practice or like any kind of like customary practice as like gone or what we're doing is we're erasing that labor and we're erasing like these really really important folks who might not have been part of the group of seven and therefore like not remembered, right?
yeah.
Or that, and I know that people don't do that kind of work, our community members don't do that kind of work so that they can be like lauded and things like that. Once again, the humility thing, it's like both a
Mhm.
blessing and a curse, the same thing like with all the generosity, but like um but I think it's just so important to like recognize that. And as galleries and museums and all of these spaces are kind of like rushing to be like the first and the biggest and all of these things, um what happens is like that erasure, and what happens is folks get stepped over or left out of the
Mhm.
conversation that really are the reason why we still know these things or like can talk about them.
I think too. I'm kind of mindful we're winding down, and
Oh,
I
sorry.
no, that's okay. I just wanted to add that exactly in what you're speaking on. There's also the fact that there's a real push to return collections
Mhm.
and to return collections to community. And I think that I just want to add my 2 cents in here on that. There has to be support and continuous support given to community institutions to be able to house that, because to house work takes a lot of work. Yeah, and
Yep.
anyone who works in collections, you have to take your hat off to people. I take my hat off to the staff at the OCF who working with collections there. That's a lot to manage. And there's a never-ending stream of requests for access and information and cataloging and photos and things, but there isn't a never-ending stream of funding for
Financial
staff
support.
to, yeah, to caretake, and specifically to caretake. What does that mean for an institution to be a caretaking institution? you've got to have a good building. You have to have a good building with climate control. You need good heating and cooling so that you can take care of artifacts. And I think supporting Indigenous communities in building their community centers and their places to hold collections is something I'm really advocate for, and I'm excited to see develop in the future.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure the OCF is doing a financial campaign right now, aren't they, to expand their operations and their
Yes.
building and do maintenance. So like, yeah, that's like when we when people are like, how can I help repatriation? How can I help reconciliation? Donate to these cultural institutions. Like it's 100%.
Yeah,
Like,
and they were registered charities. Like
yeah.
you, tax receipts done, and there's different ways to bring attention to helping. Yeah, absolutely.
Like there's community impact because of
Mhm.
the like resources and things. Like I am always impressed by how much like engagement with youth and community members are
Mhm.
done within cultural centers.
Yeah.
There is what's the word? There's like the academic impact because they're always like the number one sources that people go to.
Mhm.
Like I wouldn't have been able to do my install with the Gardiner if it wasn't for the OCF, you know? Like, and that's, you know, and it also it's honestly an echo of what has been done and is actively being done at
Mhm.
OCF already. Like it's not reinventing the wheel. I'm not going to like sit here and pretend I'm doing some groundbreaking exhibition, but like really wanting to talk about what's important to the community. And I think um that is that's an important role that like institutions, non-Indigenous institutions need to take, which is what are we like it's it isn't about like what we're presenting or like contribute.
Mhm.
How are you in good relationship? How are you in partnership? And how are you supporting rather than extracting? And
Yeah.
so,
And how are you connecting with the breadth of these communities too? That's something that's
mhm,
interesting, and I find it's interesting to the OCF as well, like as kind of like a grandmother institution, that it connects so much with people who are out of community and
mm,
people who are had been raised in care, or people
mm,
who didn't have a familial connection to community, and it kind of acts as this place where people who are ready to access and look for that, usually that's the
yeah,
first place that they contact. So
yeah,
it's like a whole extra level of community work.
yeah. It's
Hmm.
just they're such important places, and you know you're 100% right. And also, like, what does it mean to ask? I think Lisa Myers did this really cool project that was over asking and overtaking, and it was actually about gentrification, and about blueberries, and it's a beautiful like audio piece that was up in Toronto. But I think between that piece and Dylan, Dylan Robinson's like hungry listening, like thinking about what does a reciprocal relationship look like is and so I'm just going to acknowledge like one of the questions in the chat, which is like what do it's from Rebecca, what ideas do you have for institutions that want to show and instruct people about Indigenous art? What should be done to increase understanding and conversations? I think if you're coming from an institutional perspective, like I think that the question should be like, what are we offering to artists? And is this like an opportunity for artists?
Hmm.
If you're wanting to do community consultation or you're wanting to reach out to Indigenous communities because you want to like engage with them more, um, again, like what are you offering to folks before they enter in and start answering these questionnaires, right? Like,
Hmm.
how are you making people feel welcome? Are you feeding them when they come in? Are you cold calling people? Like, what's this
Yeah.
process look like?
Yeah,
Um,
and how are you welcoming family too? And I think that's
mhm,
something interesting to see in that exhibit. Like I remember my dad, he would kind of, people would always say, oh, there's Carl and his family. And then and then I had my share of that too, like, oh, he's along in the babies or the boys, and I I feel really lucky that that was modeled for me in my life. I thank my mom a lot because she did the heavy lifting there for sure, and I'm really grateful that I could bring them with me, the boys, to all these kinds of places, because that's something that another thing I hope we can encourage is family and women and babies and fathers and family in art places and family in the conversation. That's part of culture, really. That's the first base unit of the family, that it isn't this mythical individual who just appeared and is doing these things. And I think that's interesting. I saw that so much with my dad, that they wanted it to be Carl Beam appearing and he was a striking figure. There he is by himself, but he was always everywhere with us, and my mom was always right there supporting him and also working alongside him in the same material, like what we see in the exhibition. And
Yeah, those collaborative pieces are so lovely. Like they
yeah,
just
yeah.
the idea of like making art with my partner, just like it would be a
Mhm.
process. What?
Yeah, yeah, it was a process for them too. They had their moments, but it was interesting to see how much give and take there was, and how hard that is to reconcile with a Western kind of style of like attribution, that this was made by Carl Beam. Like, well, it is his work, but this piece maybe was actually built by my mom and at the design that he wanted, and then he did this. But and then maybe everybody was there digging clay,
Yeah.
or that was, yeah. There's so much,
A little
interplay.
footnote, Anong dug the clay.
Yeah, it does the
I
clay.
remember digging that clay.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was younger, I'd add those little footnotes. Like, he had this painting, Time Warp, that is in the National Gallery of Canada now. But he painted that in the gym at the high school here on the island in the 80s. And
Oh.
I remember being in the gym and I helped gesso that part in the middle. But yeah.
So cute.
Mm.
But oh, sorry, Peter's on video. Did we
Yeah.
run over time? Just
No, you're doing great. I'm just ready. We
Mhm.
just have a couple minutes left. So if you have any kind of final thoughts, um, yeah.
Well, I'm really excited to see what you do with and your work that you're doing at the Gardiner. And I'm excited to see the Gardiner taking a lead in redefining its space and reimagining that. And also thank you for the loan of the pieces to the exhibition, which is really, really wonderful that they could be there.
yeah, no, I'm gonna be down in Toronto in a couple of weeks and like 9 days. Like, I need to start packing. But I'm really, really excited to see the exhibition that you and Elka put together and see it in person and read read all the labels and read the text and do just I don't know. Again, like I don't think that anything that's happening within the gallery is groundbreaking, but I just think it's part of like these larger movements that have been happening within Indigenous run spaces and by really, really amazing folks like yourself. And I just, I'm happy. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, I'm just really happy. Like when you feel full,
Mhm.
um, to see, to see this, like, momentum and to see these conversations like kind of proliferating within like all of our different spaces and within all of these different mediums as well. And I also just love hearing stories about you and your family. I just had my first child, and so I really can't wait until me and my boy trekking around, telling him not to touch things in collections.
Checking around, checking out rocks.
Yeah, picking up a shirt by accident.
That was one of the funnest things actually about, you know, doing all the clay and everything with the boys, was setting them loose at rock cuts and exploring.
Be free.
Yep, have fun.
Yeah.
Nothing you can really break there.
Oh, so funny. But and thank you everyone for attending and listening to our conversation. And yeah, go check out the exhibition. It's really, really stunning.
Great. Thank you both so much. And thank you, yes, everyone for joining in. And please visit the exhibition. It's open until May, so lots of time. Great. Thank you so much.
Super. Thank
All right.
you.
Have a great day.